The copper braziers cast wavering shadows across the weathered walls of the Boar's Head Tavern as I settled into my familiar corner. The year was 195 AD, and Rome was no longer the city I had known in my youth. The great Marcus Aurelius was long dead, and his son Commodus had followed him to the grave. Now Septimius Severus held the throne, and strange whispers echoed through the streets of the Eternal City. I touched the deep scar that ran from my temple to my jaw, feeling the familiar ridges beneath my fingertips. Where my right eye had once been, there was now only an empty socket, hidden beneath a leather patch. My Centurion's transverse crest, once a proud crimson that had struck fear into the hearts of Rome's enemies, had long since faded to gray, much like the memories I tried so desperately to forget. The tavern was unusually crowded that night. Word had spread through Rome of disappearances in the outer provinces, of legionaries found babbling mad phrases in dead languages, of strange symbols appearing on the walls of sacred temples. These occurrences had drawn them to me, though I suspect few actually believed the story I had to tell. "Speak, old soldier," called a merchant dressed in expensive silks, his rings glinting in the firelight. "Tell us of this demon queen you claim to have fought." His tone dripped with mockery, but I detected a tremor of fear beneath his confident exterior. I lifted my cup of Falernian wine, using the moment to study the faces around me. Veterans of countless campaigns sat shoulder to shoulder with wide-eyed youths who had never seen battle. Wealthy patricians who would normally never set foot in such an establishment stood awkwardly among dockworkers and craftsmen, all of them drawn by the same darkness that had begun to seep into the Empire's bones. "I served in the 9th Legion," I began, my voice carrying the weight of years spent trying to forget. "I was there when we marched into the Black Forest, under orders from the divine Marcus Aurelius himself. I commanded the 3rd cohort, 100 men strong, all of them hardened veterans of the Parthian campaigns." A young legionary at a nearby table leaned forward. "The 9th Legion. But they disappeared." "Not all of us," I cut him off sharply. "Some survived to carry the horror of what we witnessed. I am Lucius Valerius Rufus, and before you dismiss my tale as the ramblings of a mad veteran, know that I fought at Ctesiphon under Avidius Cassius. I helped suppress the rebellion in Britannia under Calpurnius Agricola. The scars I bear are testament to 20 years of loyal service to Rome." I pulled back my sleeve to reveal the Legion's tattoo, the eagle still dark against my aged skin. Several of the veterans nodded in recognition. This was no counterfeit mark. "It began in the summer of 167 AD, I continued, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "We had received reports of unrest among the Germanic tribes in the deepest part of the Black Forest. But these were not the usual tales of tribal warfare or border raids. The reports spoke of entire villages found empty, of sacrificial sites with impossible markings, of nights when the stars themselves seemed to fade from the sky." The tavern had grown quiet now, the usual din of drunken conversation replaced by an attentive silence. Even the most skeptical listeners could sense that this was no ordinary veteran's tale. Our orders were simple: march north into the forest, locate the source of the disturbance, and restore Roman order. We were the 9th Legion, pride of Rome. We had faced Parthian cataphracts and British chariots. We had sieged cities and broken armies. I laughed bitterly. We thought ourselves invincible. We had no idea we were marching to meet something that had existed long before Rome, something that would still exist long after our empire crumbled to dust. I paused to take another drink, noting how the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, how the flames in the braziers flickered despite the lack of wind. The memories were like poison in my mind, but they needed to be shared. The signs were appearing again, just as they had before, and Rome needed to be warned. "Before I tell you what we found in that cursed forest," I said, my voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, forcing them to lean in closer, "you must understand that everything I'm about to say is true. I swear it by Jupiter Optimus Maximus, by the sacred fire of Vesta, by all the gods of Rome. Though after what I witnessed, I'm no longer certain those gods hold the power we once believed they did." The merchant who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mockery had vanished from his face, replaced by something closer to dread. Perhaps he, like so many others in Rome, had sensed the growing darkness, had felt the ancient evil stirring once again in the depths of the earth. "Tell us," he said quietly, "tell us everything." The legion departed from our fortress in Augusta Vindelicorum at dawn, 5,000 men strong. We were a sight to behold. Row upon row of gleaming armor and red cloaks, supply wagons stretching back for nearly a mile, auxiliary cavalry flanking our column. The morning sun caught our eagle standard, carried proudly at the head of the formation, its golden wings seeming to catch fire in the early light. I remember looking back at my men in the third cohort. Each contubernium of 8 men moved with perfect precision, their hobnailed boots striking the ground in unison, their shields positioned exactly as they had been trained. These were men I had fought beside for years, men who could construct a fortress in an afternoon or hold a line against overwhelming odds. Our first warning should have been the local guides. We had hired 3 of them, men who had spent their lives in the Black Forest trading with the Germanic tribes. But as we approached the border of the known territories, they grew increasingly agitated. The eldest of them, a gruff trader named Aldrich, approached me on our 4th night of march. "Centurion," he said in broken Latin, his eyes darting to the darkness beyond our watchfires. "The path ahead. It leads to the Forgotten Valley. My grandfather spoke of it. No traders go there, no hunters, the tribes avoid it." I dismissed his concerns as any proper Roman officer would. "The whole forest fears Rome now," I told him. "We'll bring civilization to every corner of it." The next morning, all 3 guides had vanished. We found their tent empty, their belongings left behind. Even their horses remained tethered, though the animals were covered in sweat, their eyes rolling with terror at something none of us could see. The legate, Quintus Cornelius Valens, ordered us to continue without them. He was a political appointee, more concerned with glory than sense, the kind of commander who had never felt blood spray across his face in real combat. I had served under his type before, but something about his dismissal of the guide's disappearance made my battle-hardened instincts scream in warning. As we pressed deeper into the forest, the very character of the land began to change. The familiar Germanic woods, with their well-worn hunting trails and occasional clearings, gave way to something more primordial. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. Their branches seemed to weave together overhead, creating a canopy so thick that by midday it felt like twilight. Our scouts reported finding symbols carved into the bark of the larger trees, not the crude markings of barbarian tribes, but intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Our camp prefect, a learned man who had studied in Alexandria, claimed they resembled no writing system known to Rome. The livestock we had brought for food began to sicken and die. The horses became increasingly difficult to control. Even the war dogs, trained from birth to fear nothing, began to howl at unseen threats in the darkness. On the 10th day of our march, we found the first village, or rather, what remained of it. The wooden buildings still stood, but they seemed wrong somehow, their angles impossible, their doorways leading to shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. The central hall was built around a stone altar, its surface stained a deep brown that I knew all too well was ancient blood. "Look at this construction," our chief engineer muttered, running his hands over the joins in the wooden beams. "These buildings, they're old. Older than anything I've seen, even in Rome. But that's impossible. The tribes here don't build like this. They've never built like this." We found no bodies, no signs of violence or struggle. Just empty homes with meals still laid out on tables, as if the inhabitants had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their daily lives. In one house, I found a child's doll lying on the floor. When I picked it up, the roughly carved wooden face seemed to turn toward me of its own accord, and I dropped it as if it had burned my hand. That night, the dreams began. I wasn't the only one who experienced them. At breakfast, I saw the haunted looks in my men's eyes, heard them whispering about what they had seen in their sleep. Dreams of a woman wearing a crown of bones, sitting on a throne made of still living flesh. Dreams of an army of the dead, marching endlessly through caves that stretched down into the bowels of the earth. I ordered extra rations of wine for my cohort. hoping it would help them sleep dreamless. But in my heart, I knew we had crossed some invisible boundary. We were no longer in lands that Rome could claim or conquer. We had entered a domain far older and darker than our empire, and it had taken notice of our presence. The next morning, our first scouts failed to return. I sent out 2 of my best men to look for them, veterans who had tracked Parthian raiders across empty deserts. They too vanished. By midday, the legate was forced to acknowledge that something was wrong. He ordered the legion to establish a defensive position, a textbook Roman response to an unclear threat. As we began to dig the fortification trenches, our spades struck something beneath the soil, not rocks or roots, but metal. We uncovered pieces of armor unlike anything I had ever seen. Black iron worked with patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. One piece appeared to be a helmet, though its shape suggested it had been made for something with a head far larger than any human's. We should leave this place, I told the legate that evening, breaking protocol by speaking so frankly to a superior officer. There's nothing here for Rome but death. He laughed, though I could see the fear behind his eyes. We are the 9th Legion, he said. We do not retreat from barbarian superstitions. That night, as I walked the perimeter of our freshly constructed fortifications, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The defensive ditches we had dug, perfect straight lines laid out by our engineers with typical Roman precision, had changed. They now formed curves and spirals, creating patterns similar to the symbols we had seen carved into the trees. When I asked the men on watch about it, they insisted the ditches hadn't been moved. To them, they still appeared to be straight lines. I knew then that we weren't just facing an enemy we couldn't defeat, we were facing an enemy we couldn't even comprehend. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our fires, something was watching us, evaluating us, perhaps even playing with us. Dawn broke with an unnatural stillness. No bird song, no rustle of leaves, just the sound of 5,000 men breathing in unison, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Our target village lay in the valley below, barely visible through a mist that seemed to glow from within. The legate ordered the advance, and we descended in standard formation, first cohort in the lead, auxiliary archers on the flanks, my third cohort positioned in the center. As we drew closer, the village's strange architecture became apparent. The buildings were Germanic in basic construction, but twisted into shapes that defied reason. Towers spiraled at impossible angles, leaning far beyond what physics should allow. Wooden walls curved inward like ribs of some vast beast. By Minerva's wisdom, whispered Flavius, my most experienced optio, look at how the shadows fall. He was right. Despite the morning sun, the shadows cast by the buildings stretched in different directions, some even seeming to point upward. More disturbing still, they appeared to move when viewed from the corner of the eye, writhing like snakes across the ground. Our advance guard reached the village's edge first. I watched as they passed between 2 tall posts marked with those same mysterious symbols we'd seen on the trees. The instant they crossed that threshold, their ordered formation broke. Men who had marched together for years suddenly couldn't walk in straight lines. They staggered like drunks, their feet following paths that seemed random to us but appeared to conform to some pattern we couldn't perceive. The legate, finally showing some wisdom, called a halt. He ordered the engineers to survey the village before we committed the entire legion to whatever strange force was at work. They brought out their measuring tools, the finest instruments from Rome's military workshops. Within minutes, they were arguing amongst themselves. This is impossible, the chief engineer declared, his face pale. According to my measurements, buildings that appear to be 20 paces apart are actually separated by 30 paces when walked. Yet the measuring line shows 10, and these angles. He held up his groma, the surveyor's cross that was used to lay out right angles. The spinning weights hung at impossible angles, as if gravity itself had gone mad. My cohort was tasked with searching the nearest buildings. We approached in testudo formation, shields locked together above and around us, though what protection Roman shields would provide against these otherworldly forces, I couldn't say. The first house we entered looked normal enough at first glance. Wooden walls, thatched roof, simple furniture. Then we noticed the details. Every piece of furniture was nailed to the floor. The nails were driven in at angles that formed more of those mysterious patterns. On the table, we found a meal laid out: bread, cheese, dried meat. It looked fresh, despite the thick layer of dust covering everything else. When one of my men tried to touch it, his hand passed through the food as if it were just an image painted on the table's surface. In the sleeping area, we found beds with indentations in them, as if bodies had just risen from them. The indentations remained when we tried to smooth them out, as permanent as if they had been carved into the wood. On one wall, a mirror hung at an odd angle. I made the mistake of looking into it. Instead of my reflection, I saw a vast chamber carved from black rock, filled with countless shrouded figures, all turning to stare at me. I ordered the mirror smashed. The deeper we pressed into the village, the worse the violations of natural law became. We found a well in the center square that had no bottom. Our longest ropes couldn't reach it, and dropped stones never made a sound. A small shrine contained statues that appeared to be carved from human bone, depicting creatures that could never have existed in our world. Most disturbing were the doors, simple wooden doors that opened into spaces far larger than the buildings that contained them. The legate established his command post in what appeared to be the village's great hall. As my men fortified the building, we discovered the first real evidence of the horror that had occurred here. Hidden beneath layers of rushes on the floor, we found a vast pattern laid out in metal and stone. It centered on a raised platform that could only have been an altar, though no altar I had ever seen bore such marks, or was shaped to hold a body in such a position. Our camp prefect spent hours studying the pattern. "It's a summoning circle," he finally declared. "I've seen references to such things in forbidden texts in Alexandria's libraries, but this is older than anything recorded. These symbols predate written language itself." That's when we found the entrance to the catacombs. A trapdoor beneath the altar led down into darkness. The legate ordered torches lit and sent a squad of legionaries to investigate. I can still hear their screams echoing up from that pit. Only 2 men returned, their hair turned white, their minds shattered by whatever they had seen in those depths. One of them managed to speak before he died, his words burning themselves into my memory. "She waits below, the queen, the bride of shadows. She has always been there, waiting, and now she knows we're here." That night, the darkness around our fires seemed deeper than natural. The village's strange angles cast shadows that moved against the firelight, forming shapes that reminded me of reaching hands. The men huddled in groups, reciting prayers to gods that suddenly seemed very far away. Even the legate's confidence had cracked. I saw him consulting with his tribunes, their faces grave as they discussed our options. We were Roman legionaries. We had been taught to fight men, to besiege cities, to build roads and bridges. But how does one fight a darkness that seeps into your mind? How does one besiege a village that defies the laws of nature? How does one build fortifications when space itself cannot be trusted? As I lay down to sleep that night, I noticed something that chilled me to my core. The wooden beams above my head had changed position since we'd entered the building. They now formed a pattern that was achingly familiar, the same crown-like symbol I had seen in my dreams, the one worn by the figure on the throne of flesh. We were not the hunters here, we were the prey, and our predator was done watching from the shadows. Sleep brought no respite. In my dreams, I walked endless corridors of black stone, following the sound of a woman's laughter that echoed from everywhere and nowhere. The air grew colder as I descended, until I could see my breath crystallizing in front of me. At the end of each corridor stood a mirror, and in each reflection, I saw myself growing older, my flesh withering, my armor crumbling to rust, until only a skeleton remained, still walking, still searching. I woke to screaming. 3 more men had vanished during the night, not taken, but simply gone, as if they had never existed. Their companions remembered them, but all physical traces had disappeared. Their weapons, their armor, their personal effects, all gone. Even the morning's duty roster, written in my own hand, had changed, showing no record of their names. The legate called a council of the senior officers. In the pre-dawn gloom, we gathered in the great hall, standing around the cursed altar like mourners at a funeral. The camp prefect had spent the night studying the texts and artifacts we'd found scattered throughout the village. "This place," he began, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep, was never meant to be a village. It's a prison, a cage built to contain something ancient. He spread out several pieces of parchment on the altar. The writing was like nothing I'd seen before. Letters that seemed to move on the page, rearranging themselves when viewed directly. From what I can decipher, he continued, it began thousands of years ago, long before Rome, before even the Greeks. There was a queen who ruled a kingdom now lost to time. She discovered secrets, dark magic that allowed her to conquer death itself. But the power corrupted her. She became something inhuman, raising armies of the dead, turning her realm into a kingdom of nightmares. A cold wind whipped through the hall, though all the doors were closed. The torches flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. The gods themselves intervened, the prefect said, his fingers tracing the strange symbols. Not our gods, but the old ones, the ones that were worshipped in the time before time. They couldn't kill her. She had grown too powerful. So they imprisoned her, binding her in the depths of the earth. This village, these symbols, the very geometry of this place, it's all part of her prison. And now, the legate asked, his voice barely a whisper, now the bindings are weakening. Each generation, the villagers performed rituals to maintain the prison, but something went wrong. They made a mistake in the ceremony, or perhaps she finally grew strong enough to influence them. Either way, the prison is failing, and he laughed bitterly, we marched an entire legion right into her trap. As if to punctuate his words, a deep rumble emanated from beneath our feet. The metal pieces in the floor pattern began to vibrate, producing a sound like distant screaming. Several of the younger officers made signs to ward off evil. That's when Flavius burst into the hall, his face streaked with blood. Centurion, the men, you need to see this. I followed him to the barracks we'd established in one of the larger buildings. 20 men lay on their pallets, convulsing, their eyes rolled back in their heads. As I watched in horror, they began to speak in unison, their voices overlapping in a cascade of languages, Latin, Greek, and others far older. She comes, they chanted. The Queen of Hell stirs in her chains. The door opens, the path clears, first in dreams, then in shadows, then in flesh. Their skin began to blister and crack, revealing not blood and bone beneath, but a darkness that seemed to swallow light. I ordered the medicus to sedate them, but before he could act, all 20 men sat up simultaneously. Their eyes opened, revealing not white and iris, but swirling voids that made my soul recoil. Your weapons cannot harm her. They spoke as one, their voices now carrying an alien resonance. Your walls cannot stop her. Your gods cannot save you. She was old when the first human learned to make fire. She will be there when the last star burns out. Then, as suddenly as it began, the possession ended. The men collapsed, their bodies returning to normal. None of them remembered what had happened, but all spoke of dreams where they had walked through vast underground halls, led by a beautiful woman wearing a crown of darkness. The legate finally broke. I saw it in his eyes, that moment when a man's courage shatters and his only thought is escape. He ordered an immediate retreat. It was the right decision, but it came far too late. As the Legion prepared to withdraw, we discovered that the village had changed again. Buildings had shifted position, streets had rearranged themselves. Every path that seemed to lead out of the village now curved back toward its center. We were being herded, drawn inexorably toward the great hall and the darkness that waited below. That's when we found the first survivor from the original village. He had been hiding in a secret room, sealed behind walls covered in protective symbols. His mind was mostly gone, but in his lucid moments, he drew us a map of the catacombs beneath the village. The binding stones, he muttered, pointing to marked locations on his crude diagram. They must be maintained. The sacrifices must continue. She must not wake. She must not. His eyes suddenly widened in terror. You wear her mark already. She's chosen you. His finger pointed directly at me. Before I could question him further, his body went rigid. Black fluid began to leak from his eyes and mouth. He managed one final, horrible smile before his flesh began to dissolve, leaving behind only a hollow skin that crumbled to dust in front of us. The legate, his last vestiges of Roman dignity asserting themselves, straightened his cloak. "Centurion," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Gather volunteers. We go below at dawn. If we cannot escape this place, we will face this queen of hell with Roman steel and Roman courage." I wanted to tell him how futile that would be, how meaningless our weapons and courage were against what waited in the darkness. But I was a Roman officer, I had sworn an oath, so I saluted, turned on my heel, and went to prepare my men for a battle I knew we could not win. We assembled before dawn, 50 volunteers drawn from across the legion. Each man had been chosen not just for their combat skill but for their mental fortitude. Veterans of the bloodiest campaigns, men who had seen friends die in the most horrific ways yet maintained their sanity. How little we understood what true horror was. Our armor had continued to degrade overnight. The metal was pitted and scarred, covered in patterns that resembled screaming faces when viewed in torchlight. The leather straps had hardened and cracked, as if they had aged decades and hours. Even our weapons felt wrong in our hands. The balance altered, the edges dulled despite constant sharpening. The camp prefect insisted on performing a ritual before we descended. He had spent the night studying the villagers' texts, learning protective rites that he claimed might shield us from the worst of what waited below. We stood in a circle around the altar as he chanted in a language that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "The symbols on your shields," he explained, painting strange characters on our armor with a mixture of ash and blood. "They bind you to the world above. Do not let them be broken. Do not look directly at her, and whatever you hear, whatever she promises you, do not speak her name." As we prepared to descend into the catacombs, a sound echoed up from below, a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language older than words. Several men collapsed, blood trickling from their ears. Those who remained conscious described hearing different things in the song: promises of power, reunions with lost loved ones, freedom from the terror of death. The entrance to the underworld was a wound in the earth, a circular pit that descended at an angle that seemed to shift as we watched it. The steps were carved from black stone that absorbed our torchlight rather than reflecting it. They spiraled down into darkness, each turn taking us deeper into the cold heart of the world. Our first contact with her forces came 3 levels down. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber supported by columns carved to resemble writhing bodies. In the center stood a figure that, at first glance, appeared to be one of our missing scouts. He wore Legion armor, carried a Legion shield, but when he turned to face us, we saw that his flesh had been replaced by a shifting darkness that leaked from the seams of his equipment. "Brothers," it spoke with our comrade's voice, "she offers you a choice. Join us willingly and receive power beyond your comprehension. Resist and be broken before you are remade." Publius, a veteran of 20 years' service, stepped forward. "Gaius," he called out, recognizing the thing that had once been his friend. "What happened to you?" The creature smiled, its teeth gleaming like shards of obsidian. "I have been perfected. The Queen of Hell sees the rot in your empire, the weakness in your gods. She offers transcendence." As it spoke, more figures emerged from behind the columns. I recognized them all. Our missing men, now transformed into these dark parodies of themselves. They moved with an unnatural grace, their armor floating inches above their shadow flesh. The legate raised his sword. "Form testudo," he commanded, his voice steady despite the horror before us. We locked our shields together, creating a fortress of steel and discipline. It was a formation that had withstood barbarian charges and Parthian arrows. Against what came next, it was as effective as paper in a flame. The Shadow Legionaries didn't charge. Instead, they began to sing, taking up the same lullaby we had heard from above. The sound bypassed our ears and spoke directly to our souls. I watched in horror as the youngest of our volunteers, a Greek auxiliary named Alexandros, threw down his shield and walked toward them, his eyes filled with tears of joy. "Mother," he whispered, "I can see you. I'm coming home." The instant he crossed the midpoint of the chamber, the Shadow Legionaries swarmed him. There was no blood, no violence. They simply enveloped him in their darkness. When they pulled back, he had joined their ranks, his flesh transformed into the same writhing shadows. The legate gave the order to attack. We charged forward in perfect formation, our shields locked, our spears extended. I heard the prefect shouting protective incantations, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. The Shadow Legionaries met our charge with inhuman speed and strength. Our weapons passed through their bodies as if they were made of smoke, but their touches burned like frozen fire. Wherever their shadows fell across our armor, the protective symbols the prefect had painted began to fade. I saw a man's shield shatter into dust when one of the creatures struck it, saw another soldier age decades in seconds when a shadow hand grasped his face. Flavius fought beside me, his sword moving in perfect arcs that should have severed limbs but instead cut only darkness. "The symbols," he shouted. "Aim for the symbols on their armor. They're still bound to them like we are." He was right. When our blades struck the legion markings they still wore, the creatures recoiled. We began to target these vulnerable points, and for a moment, it seemed we might have found a way to fight them. That's when she made her presence known. The chamber went silent. The Shadow Legionaries stepped back, forming a circle around us. The darkness between the columns began to move with purpose, flowing like liquid night toward the center of the room. It rose up, taking the shape of a woman of impossible beauty and terrible majesty. She wore a crown that seemed to be made of concentrated darkness, and her eyes held the wisdom of eons and the cruelty of countless millennia. When she spoke, her voice was both a whisper and a scream, the sound of civilization's first murder and its last breath. "My children," she said, and every man in our formation fell to his knees, our weapons clattering to the stone floor. "You have come so far to find me. Come further still. Let me show you what your empire could become under my rule." She raised her hands, and the walls of the chamber became mirrors, showing us visions of Rome transformed. I saw the Senate House filled with shadow legislators, their decisions guided by her infinite wisdom. I saw legions of immortal warriors pushing the empire's borders beyond the edges of the known world. I saw the streets of Rome where no one feared death because death had been conquered. The visions were beautiful, perfect, and utterly wrong. Something in me, perhaps the iron discipline of Roman training, or some deeper, more primal instinct for survival, broke through her spell. I forced my eyes away from the mirrors, focusing instead on the protective symbols that still glowed faintly on my armor. Around me, my fellow soldiers remained entranced, their faces filled with longing for the dark paradise she offered. The chamber had grown colder, frost formed on our armor, cracking the leather and rusting the metal before our eyes. The Queen of Hell moved among us like smoke, her fingers trailing across shoulders and backs, leaving trails of shadow that began to seep through the gaps in our equipment. "Your empire is dying," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "I have watched it rise from nothing. I will watch it fall to dust. But you, my chosen warriors, need not share its fate." The legate was the first to break. He threw himself at her feet, tearing off his armor to better receive her touch. The shadow took him quickly. In moments, he had joined the ranks of her Shadow Legionaries, his flesh transformed into living darkness. Others followed, either embracing their transformation or simply unable to resist her power. I watched men I had known for years, men I had fought beside and bled beside, surrender themselves to her darkness. Each transformation strengthened her presence, making the air itself feel thick with ancient power. That's when the storm began. It started deep in the earth, a rumbling that grew into a roar that shook loose stones from the ceiling. The chamber's architecture began to shift, the columns twisting into new shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. The floor cracked, and from the fissures rose a wind that carried the screams of every soul she had ever claimed. "The binding weakens," she announced, her voice now a chorus of thousands. "The prison your gods built for me crumbles. The storm of unmaking rises. Choose now, serve me and survive, or die with your empire." The wind grew stronger, howling through the chamber with hurricane force. It carried more than just sound. Within it, I could see faces forming and dissolving, could hear snippets of conversations from ancient times, could feel the weight of histories that had been erased from the world. The remaining loyal soldiers tried to maintain formation, but the storm tore us apart. I saw men lifted off their feet, their bodies contorting as the supernatural wind pulled at their souls. The Shadow Legionaries moved through the chaos with perfect grace, reaching out to catch their former comrades as they fell. Through it all, she stood unmoved, her crown of darkness now a swirling vortex that seemed to pull in all light. Her beauty had become terrible to behold, no longer just a woman, but a being of cosmic horror barely contained in human form. Wings of pure shadow extended from her back, each feather a slice of void that cut through reality itself. "Look upon me," she commanded, and we could not disobey. "See what I truly am." Her face shifted, showing us her true form. I saw a being older than time, a consciousness that had existed in the spaces between the first atoms of creation. I saw the death of stars reflected in her eyes, saw civilizations rise and fall in the curve of her smile. The human mind was never meant to comprehend such things. 3 men went mad instantly, their minds shattering under the weight of that revelation. The camp prefect made his final stand then. Clutching his stolen texts, he began to recite the binding ritual that had originally imprisoned her. The words twisted in the air, glowing with their own light, forming chains of pure force that tried to wrap around her form. She laughed, a sound that made blood leak from our eyes, and shattered his chains with a gesture. "Your borrowed power cannot bind me again. The old gods are dead or sleeping. There is no one left to hear your prayers." The prefect didn't stop. Even as shadow began to consume him, he continued his ritual. The symbols he had painted on our armor flared with unexpected power. For a moment, her darkness was pushed back. She snarled in rage and gestured. The prefect's body imploded, crushed by invisible forces until nothing remained but a fine, red mist. But his sacrifice had given us a chance. In that moment of her anger, I saw her true weakness, pride. She could have simply destroyed us all instantly, but she wanted to savor her victory, wanted us to choose damnation of our own free will. I raised my sword, not to attack her, which would have been futile, but to rally the survivors. "Rome," I shouted above the howling storm. "Remember your oaths, remember your honor." A handful of men responded, fighting their way through the tempest to form a ring around me. We raised our shields, the glowing symbols creating a circle of light in the darkness. It wasn't much, perhaps 20 men out of the 50 we had brought below, but it was enough to make her pause. "Interesting," she purred, head tilting in an inhuman angle. "Most interesting. I had forgotten how stubborn your kind could be. Very well. If you will not serve me willingly, I will show you the true meaning of power." The storm intensified. Reality itself began to tear around us. Through the gaps, I caught glimpses of her kingdom. An endless realm of shadow and horror where the laws of nature meant nothing and time itself ran backward. The very stone beneath our feet started to transform, becoming an organic, pulsing mass that reached up with pseudopods of living rock to grab at our legs. We fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Our shields, still bearing the prefect's dying enchantments, provided some protection against her direct power, but nothing could save us from the horror of our surroundings. The chamber had become a living thing, its walls breathing, its floor flowing like liquid stone. The air itself seemed to fight against us, thick with shadows that caught at our limbs and whispered promises of peace if we would only surrender. Her shadow legionaries pressed their attack with renewed vigor. I watched in horror as Flavius, my most trusted Optio, finally fell. A tendril of darkness pierced his shield, touching his forehead. The transformation was different this time, slower, more painful. He aged decades in seconds, his skin splitting as the shadow worked its way through his veins like poison. "Centurion," he gasped, his voice already changing, becoming a chorus of the damned. "Tell my family, tell them." But before he could finish, his humanity was gone, replaced by another of her dark soldiers. We were down to 12 men now, our circle growing smaller with each passing moment. The storm had become a tempest of cosmic horror, reality breaking down around us. Through the tears in space-time, I caught glimpses of her true kingdom. Endless cities of black stone where the dead walked in eternal servitude. Vast armies of shadow preparing for the day of her final victory, and things that defied description. Horrors that lurked between dimensions waiting to be called forth. She moved through the chaos like a dancer, her every gesture bringing fresh nightmares to life. The crown of darkness above her head had grown, becoming a swirling vortex of void that threatened to swallow all light, all hope, all reality. "Your resistance is exquisite," she said, her voice somehow clear despite the howling storm. "In all the millennia of my existence, few have fought me with such determination. You will make a perfect herald." Before I could react, she was before me, moving faster than thought. Her hand, beautiful and terrible, reached out to touch my face. I tried to raise my shield, but my arms wouldn't move. Her power held me paralyzed as she cupped my cheek with a tenderness that was somehow worse than violence. "Look at me, little soldier," she commanded. "Look upon your queen." I had no choice. I met her gaze and saw eternity. Her eyes were windows into the void between stars, into the darkness that existed before creation and would remain after the last light died. In them, I saw the truth of her, a being so vast and ancient that the human mind could only perceive the smallest fraction of her existence, like an ant trying to comprehend an ocean. "You think your gods are powerful," she whispered, her breath cold against my skin. "They are children playing with forces they barely understand. I am older than worship. I am older than death itself. And you, my brave Centurion, will help me reclaim what was taken from me." Her finger traced a line down my face, from temple to jaw. The pain was indescribable. It felt like she was writing directly on my soul, marking me with symbols in a language that predated human speech. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice had been stolen by the storm. "I mark you as mine," she declared. "You will walk in the world above, but you will never truly leave my realm. In dreams, in shadows, in the spaces between moments, you will be mine. And when the time comes, when the stars align and the old bindings finally shatter, you will lead my armies back into the world of light." Through the haze of pain, I saw my remaining men trying to reach me, fighting against her shadow legionaries with desperate courage. She gestured almost casually, and they were blown back by an invisible force. But she didn't kill them. No, she had something far worse in mind. "Watch," she commanded, forcing my head to turn toward my soldiers. "Watch as I show you the first taste of your new power." The shadows around us coalesced, forming tentacles of pure darkness that wrapped around my men. As I watched, helpless to intervene, the darkness began to seep into their bodies. But this wasn't the quick transformation she had inflicted on the others. This was slower, more intimate, more horrific. I could feel their pain, could feel the darkness working its way through their flesh, their minds, their souls. The mark she had placed on me somehow connected me to them, made me experience every moment of their transformation. Their screams echoed not just in my ears, but in my very being. "They are yours now," she said, her voice filled with dark pleasure. "Your first command. You will have many more before the end." The transformation complete, my men stood changed. They were neither fully human nor completely shadow, but something in between. Tortured souls bound to my will through her power. Their eyes, once filled with Roman courage, now held only endless night. "A gift," she explained, "to remind you of our time together. They will obey your commands, live as long as you live, die only when you die. And every time you look at them, every time you use the power I have given you, you will remember who truly owns your soul." The aftermath of our encounter with the Queen of Hell defied explanation to the outside world. How could we explain that an entire legion had simply vanished, leaving behind only a handful of survivors who seemed to neither age nor die? The official records listed the 9th Legion as lost in a Germanic uprising. It was easier for Rome to accept that lie than to face the truth of what lurked in the dark places of the world. Those first years were the hardest. I tried to return to normal military service, but the mark she had left on me made that impossible. My dreams were no longer my own. Each night, I walked through her realm, watching as she prepared for her eventual return. I saw vast armies of the dead being forged in pits of living shadow, saw ancient beings pledging their allegiance to her crown, saw the slow but inevitable weakening of the barriers between worlds. My transformed men followed me like shadows, neither fully alive nor truly dead. They spoke only when spoken to, their voices carrying echoes of the storm that had transformed them. To others, they appeared as normal soldiers, if somewhat quiet and strange. But I could see their true nature, the darkness that swirled beneath their skin, the void that had replaced their souls. The mark on my face became a source of terror for those who looked upon it too long. Though it appeared to be a simple scar, those who studied it reported seeing it move, forming shapes that hurt the mind to contemplate. Mirrors became my enemy. In every reflection I could see her realm bleeding through into ours, could see her watching me with patient amusement. I tried to find ways to break the curse. I consulted priests of every religion, traveled to the farthest reaches of the empire, seeking wisdom. In Alexandria, I spent months in the Great Library, studying texts of forbidden knowledge. In Petra, I spoke with mystics who claimed to understand the spaces between worlds. In the temples of Parthia, I learned rituals that promised to cleanse the soul of darkness. Nothing worked. Each failure seemed to amuse her more, and her whispers in my mind grew stronger. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, I would find myself using the power she had given me. A gesture would send my cursed soldiers to fulfill my wishes. A word would let me see through the veil between worlds. Each time I drew on her power, I felt her satisfaction, felt the bonds of her ownership tighten around my soul. The years brought stranger torments. I discovered that I could no longer die. Wounds that should have been fatal healed themselves, leaving behind scars that formed more of her symbols on my flesh. Disease couldn't touch me. Even poison merely left me in agony, unable to find release in death. My cursed soldiers shared this horrific immortality. We were all bound together, preserved by her power for her own dark purposes. Time became fluid, unreliable. Sometimes weeks would pass in what felt like moments. Other times, a single night would stretch for what seemed like years as I wandered the depths of her realm in my dreams. I watched empires rise and fall, saw generations pass like leaves in the wind, all while carrying the weight of her mark. The worst part was the knowledge, the terrible, cosmic knowledge she had poured into my mind. I understood things no mortal was meant to comprehend. I could see the true nature of reality, could perceive the thin membrane that separated our world from infinite others. In quiet moments, I could hear the songs of dead stars and the whispers of beings that existed before time itself. And always, I could feel her patient anticipation. She had existed for eons before claiming me, and she could wait eons more. My torment was just a small amusement to her, a way to pass the time until the stars aligned and the old bindings finally failed. Others marked by her began to find me. They were different from my transformed soldiers. These were humans she had touched throughout history, each bearing their own unique curses. We formed a silent brotherhood of the damned, sharing what little comfort we could find in our shared torment. One of them, an Egyptian priest who had been marked 3 centuries before I was born, taught me to project my consciousness beyond my cursed body. It was a dangerous technique. Leaving my flesh meant risking her direct influence over my soul, but it provided brief moments of relief from the constant weight of her presence. The priest didn't survive long after sharing this knowledge. I found him one morning, his body twisted into impossible angles, his face frozen in an expression of ecstasy and horror. On the wall above his corpse, written in shadows that moved under my gaze, was a message: "All paths lead back to me." As centuries passed, I began to notice patterns in the chaos. Her influence wasn't random. It followed rules incomprehensible to human minds, but nevertheless consistent in their cosmic horror. The boundaries between worlds grew thinnest at certain times. In certain places, her power waxed and waned like a dark tide affected by the movements of planets and stars that had died before Earth was born. I started keeping records, trying to map these patterns. My cursed soldiers helped, their otherworldly senses able to detect fluctuations in reality that normal humans couldn't perceive. We traced ley lines of supernatural energy, marked sites where the veil between worlds had worn thin, documented signs and omens that preceded manifestations of her power. What emerged was a picture more terrifying than anything I had imagined. The binding that held her wasn't just weakening, it was being systematically dismantled. Each strange occurrence, each supernatural manifestation, was part of a vast pattern that stretched across time and space. She wasn't just waiting to break free, she was orchestrating her own release with the patience of an immortal being. The tavern had grown deathly quiet as I spoke. The braziers had burned low, their flames now an unnatural blue that cast strange shadows on the walls. My audience sat transfixed, their cups of wine untouched, their faces pale in the ethereal light. You think this is just a story, I said, noting how the shadows behind them seemed to move with purpose. A tale told by an old soldier who's seen too much battle, drunk too much wine. But look around you. Look at Rome itself. Haven't you noticed the changes? The merchant who had mocked me earlier wiped sweat from his brow. The disappearances, he whispered. In the outer provinces. Not just the outer provinces anymore, I corrected him. Here, in the heart of the empire, people vanishing without trace. Others returning changed, their voices carrying echoes of something ancient and dark. The symbols appearing on temple walls, patterns that drive men mad if they look at them too long. A young legionary stood up, his hand on his sword. You're saying these things are connected to your Queen of Hell? That's impossible. The gods protect Rome. I laughed bitterly. The gods, where were they when she took my legion? Where are they now as her influence spreads through their temples like poison? The old bindings are failing. The power of Rome's gods wanes while she grows stronger. To demonstrate, I gestured to my cursed soldiers, who had been standing so still in the shadows that most of the tavern's patrons hadn't even noticed them. At my command, they stepped forward into the firelight, allowing their human disguise to slip just enough to reveal their true nature. Several people screamed as they saw the darkness moving beneath their skin, the void that had replaced their eyes. These men were once proud Roman legionaries, I explained. Now they are neither living nor dead, bound to me as I am bound to her. They are just a small example of her power, a tiny ripple in the cosmic horror that approaches. The temperature in the tavern plummeted. Frost formed on wine cups and wooden beams. The shadows in the corners grew deeper, more substantive. The signs are everywhere if you know how to read them, I continued. The dreams that plague the city, filled with visions of crowned figures and endless halls of black stone. The way time seems to stutter and skip, moments stretching into hours or condensing into seconds. Even the stars, look up on a clear night, and you'll see gaps in the familiar constellations, places where the light seems to be swallowed by something vast and hungry. I pulled out a scroll, spreading it on the table before me. On it was a map of Rome and its territories, marked with hundreds of symbols and notations accumulated over centuries of observation. Each mark represents a manifestation of her power, I explained. A breach in the veil between worlds, a site where the natural laws have begun to break down. For centuries, these occurrences were rare, isolated. But look, in the past year alone, the frequency has increased tenfold. The pattern is expanding, growing like a cancer in the heart of the empire. One of the veterans leaned forward to study the map. His face went pale as he recognized a symbol marking a recent incident. The 4th Legion, he muttered. We found their camp empty last month. No signs of battle, no bodies, just empty armor arranged in perfect formation. She's building her army, I said grimly. Each disappearance, each strange occurrence adds to her power. The transformation that claimed my legion is spreading, but slower this time, more subtle. She learned from her previous attempt. Why rule through fear when you can corrupt from within? A cold wind swept through the tavern, though all doors and windows were closed. The blue flames in the braziers flickered wildly, casting shadows that momentarily took the shape of crowned figures, dancing on the walls. I've watched empires rise and fall, I continued, seen countless armies march to glory or defeat. But what comes now is different. She's not interested in merely conquering Rome. She wants to remake reality itself, to break down the barriers between worlds and reshape existence according to her will. The merchant found his voice again, though it trembled. If what you say is true, why tell us? What can we possibly do against such power? Because knowledge is power, I replied. Even she can be resisted. Her influence fought. The prefect proved that when he died protecting us with his rituals. The old gods may be weakening, but there are other forces in the world, other ways to fight back against the darkness. I reached into my cloak and withdrew a bundle of papers, copies of the protective symbols and rituals I had gathered over centuries of research. These markings, if properly drawn, can shield a house from her influence. These prayers spoken in the right sequence can break her hold on those who haven't been fully claimed. It's not much, but The words died in my throat as every flame in the tavern suddenly went out, plunging us into absolute darkness. In the distance, a low rumble shook the foundations of Rome itself. The air grew thick with the scent of ancient stone and cosmic horror. In the pitch darkness of the tavern, I felt her presence before I saw any sign of her manifestation. The mark on my face burned with familiar agony, responding to its maker's proximity. Around me, I heard the panicked breathing of the tavern's patrons, punctuated by the soft sounds of my cursed soldiers shifting into defensive positions. When light returned, it came not from the braziers but from the shadows themselves, a negative illumination that made darkness glow and light retreat. The tavern's interior began to transform, its mundane wooden walls taking on the characteristics of her realm. The grain patterns in the wood writhed like living things, forming and reforming into faces caught in eternal screams. My faithful herald, her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. How generous of you to gather such a lovely audience for me. The people in the tavern tried to run, but the doors had sealed themselves, the wood transforming into the same black stone I remembered from her underground kingdom. The windows showed not the streets of Rome but vast, impossible landscapes, cities built from shadow and bone, oceans of liquid darkness that flowed upward instead of down, skies filled with stars that moved with deliberate purpose. She materialized in the center of the room, her crown of darkness scraping the ceiling, which retreated upward to accommodate her presence. She was exactly as I remembered, yet somehow more terrible. Centuries of growing power had made her even more difficult for mortal minds to comprehend. "You've done well," she said, gesturing at my audience. "Each soul you've touched with your story, each mind you've opened to the possibility of my existence, they're all little cracks in the binding that holds me. Your warnings intended to save them have only made them more vulnerable to my influence." I reached for the protective symbols I had gathered, but they crumbled to dust in my hands. She laughed, that same soul-piercing sound that had haunted my dreams for centuries. "Did you think I would allow such simple defenses to work again? I am not bound by the same rules as before. The stars have shifted. The old gods sleep more deeply. Reality itself has grown thin and tired, ready to be reshaped by my will." The tavern's patrons were changing as she spoke. Those nearest to her were already transforming, their flesh becoming translucent, showing the darkness that poured into them like wine into empty vessels. The merchant who had mocked me earlier fell to his knees, his expensive silks melting into his skin as shadow replaced his blood. My cursed soldiers moved to protect the others, their partial immunity to her power allowing them to resist the immediate effects of her presence. But she merely waved her hand, and they froze in place. "Your time as their master is over," she declared. "The mark I gave you was always a leash with two ends. Now I take back what is mine." I watched in horror as my soldiers, my companions through centuries of torment, dissolved into pure shadow and flowed into her crown. Their final expressions were ones of relief, a release from the half-life I had forced them to endure. "Stop this," I commanded, trying to summon whatever power she had left me. "These people are under my protection." She smiled, and in that smile I saw the death of worlds. "My dear Centurion, you never had any power of your own. Everything you are, everything you've done, has served my purpose. Your centuries of wandering, each step took you exactly where I needed you to be. Your warnings to others, each one spread my influence further. Even this moment, your final act of defiance, is exactly what I designed you to do." The walls of the tavern were completely gone now, replaced by shifting barriers of pure darkness that pulsed with alien geometries. The transformed patrons had begun to move in impossible ways, their bodies twisting into new shapes that owed nothing to earthly biology. "Behold," she said, raising her arms, "the beginning of my new kingdom." Through gaps in reality, I could see similar scenes playing out across Rome. Temples collapsed as ancient things emerged from their foundations. The streets ran with living shadows that consumed everything they touched. The sky itself was changing, the familiar stars being devoured by a darkness that had waited billions of years to feed. "Why show me this?" I asked, even as I felt my own form beginning to change, the centuries of her mark finally claiming me completely. "Because you were my favorite," she answered, reaching out to touch my face one last time. "My perfect herald, the Roman soldier who carried my darkness into the world while fighting so hard against it. Your struggle was exquisite, your torment a pleasure to watch, and now you get to see the fruit of your labors." As her finger traced the scar she had given me so long ago, I felt the last of my humanity dissolving. The truth of my existence crashed down upon me with the weight of epochs. I had never escaped her, never truly resisted. Every action I had taken, every warning I had given, had been orchestrated to serve her goals. The last thing I saw as my eyes transformed into windows of void was Rome itself beginning to sink into a sea of living darkness. The Queen of Hell had kept her promise from centuries ago. She had shown me exactly what the Empire would become under her rule. And somewhere in the infinite darkness that had once been my soul, I heard her laughter echoing through the corridors of eternity, a sound that would continue long after the last light in the universe finally died.